Hey everybody, Janae is here. I will be studying today. I hope y'all are doing well. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon. Right now is morning for me. Good morning. So today I'm going to be doing some reading. I talked a little bit about bureaucracy, and so I'm going to read a little bit more about bureaucracy. So this is actually part two. I have to note that in the video. This is part two, studying the bureaucracy with me. So I'm going to get started. The title here is Challenges to the Bureaucracy. So we're going to talk about some of the challenges with the bureaucracy. So maybe I can do a brief recap. We mentioned, or I read a little bit about some of the executive departments. So I'm going to go ahead and read some of the executive departments. So we know there's 15 of the cabinet departments. And so I'm going to go ahead and read those 15 departments. So there's state, which has 41,768 employees. There's treasury, which has, okay, these never mind. Okay, that's wrong. There was 41,768 employees in the state, but that was in 1789. All right, so I probably shouldn't read that one then. But I'll read the actual departments. I won't tell you how many employees that there is. Let me see. Oh, that was the year that it was established. I'm sorry. Okay, so I'm just going to read the 15 cabinet departments. Okay, so there's state, there's treasury, there's interior, there's justice, there's agriculture, there's commerce, there's labor, there's defense, there's housing and urban development, there's transportation, there's energy, there's health and human services, there's education, there's veteran affairs, and there's homeland security. So that's all 15. All right. So the cabinet department, one of the 15 departments of the executive branch, state treasury, defense, justice, interior, agriculture, commerce, labor, health and human services, homeland security, housing and urban development, education, energy, transportation, and veteran affairs. Right. So that is the 15 department of the executive branch. Line organization in the federal government and administrative unit that is directly accountable to the president. Government functions such as printing money and securing the border. These departments were created by Congress when the need for each department arose. The first to be created was state, and the most recent was Homeland Security, established in 2003. The difficulties faced in creating that new department are discussed in the Recognizing to Stop Terrorism section. All right, so I'm going to get started with challenges to the bureaucracy. With cabinet departments, all 15, with cabinet departments, independent executive agencies, independent regulatory agencies, and government corporations, the federal bureaucracy is both complex and very specialized. Each agency, corporation, or line department has its own mission, its own goals, and in many cases, its own constituents, either at home or, in the case of the State Department, abroad. However, some problems and crises require the attention of multiple agencies. In these cases, overlapping jurisdictions can cause confusion, or problems may arise that no agency has the authority to solve. A famous story about a Carter administration illustrates this point. President Jimmy Carter believes he smelled something dead behind his Oval Office wall, probably a mouse. His staff called the General Service Off Administration, which has responsibility for the White House, but those bureaucrats claimed it was not their problem. They had fumigated recently, so the mouse must have come in from the outside. The Department of the Interior, which has responsibility for the gardens and grounds, refused to help because the mouse was now inside. Eventually, the interagency task force was created to remove the mouse. If solving one small problem was this complicated for the federal bureaucracy, consider larger issues such as terrorism and natural disasters. There was a word here in this paragraph. It was fumigated. I want to enter that in my phone because I never heard that word before, and I don't know what it means, and I don't even know if I'm pronouncing it correctly. It's spelled Fumigated. I pronounce it fumigated, so I'm gonna press this pronunciation button. Fumigate. They call it fumigate. So that would be fumigated. I said fumigated. It's fumigated. And then the definition means to disinfect or purify an area with the fumes of certain chemicals. So to disinfect, to purify, to sterilize. So fumigate. So they had fumigated recently. So there was a time they fumigated, they disinfected recently. It says, so the mouse must have come from the outside, and the Department of the Interior, which has responsibility for the gardens and grounds, refused to help because the mouse was now inside. So they're like, okay, that's not my problem anymore. The mouse is inside. Eventually, the interagency task force was created to remove the mouse. So the interagency task was created to remove the mouse. All right. So it solved one small problem, but was this complicated for the federal bureaucracy? Consider larger issues such as terrorism and natural disasters. So if solving one problem was this complicated for the federal bureaucracy, consider larger issues such as terrorism and natural disasters. Okay, moving on. So reorganizing the Stop Terrorism. Reorganizing the Stop Terrorism. All right, what is terrorism? What is terrorism? So I associate terrorism with things like war. I associate it with maybe some foreign country involving some form of war or attack. Terrorism is the unlawful use of violence and intimidation, especially against civilians in the pursuit of political aims. So there's 5 types of terrorisms, but that's going way off track. So the state-sponsored terrorism, dissent terrorism, and the right and left. Okay, now this one says 3 types of terrorism. So I'm just Googling, you guys. When I look up information, I Google. I love Google. I really do. The internet is amazing, amazing. It did amazing things in our world with the internet, having that access, like bam, bam, bam. Again, like not sure. I look to like Google. I do. I try to look up other sources for information, but Google is like my first place. I know there's some really good websites out there, like the EDU websites. .gov, those are like really good websites. But I like Google. I like Google. All right. So reorganizing to stop terrorism. So after September 11th, 2001, the nation saw that no single agency was responsible for coordinating anti-terrorism efforts. So no one was responsible for coordinating anti-terrorism efforts. So nor was one person able to muster a nationwide response to a terrorist attack. So no one was able to muster a nationwide response to a terrorist attack. So fighting terrorism involves so many different efforts: screening baggage at airports, inspecting freight shipment, and protecting the border, to name just a few, that coordinating them would be impossible unless all of these functions were combined in one agency. The creation of the Department of Homeland Security, DHS, in 2003 was the largest reorganization of the U.S. since 1947. So they finally created some other things to that department in 2003. So if we take let's take 2003. Well, let's just do 1947. And then I can like subtract 2003. 56 is the number that you get. So 56 years. So it's 56 years before they finally updated and made some changes with this department. 56 years. So 22 agencies with responsibilities for preventing terrorism were merged into a single department. So they merged 22 agencies with responsibilities to preventing terrorism into a single department. Oh, wow, that's a lot. So Congress and the president agreed that combining the Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA, Customs and Border Protection, the Coast Guards, the Secret Service, and many other organizations into a single agency would promote efficiency and improve coordination. It now has more than 190,000 employees and a proposed budget of $64 billion in 2016. The department's Twitter feed and website offer helpful suggestions and tips. It proved difficult to integrate agencies whose missions were very different. Some suggested that the bureaucratic cultures of agencies focused on law enforcement, such as Secret Service on the Border Patrol, would be difficult to mesh with the agencies that focus on problems faced by citizens in a time of natural disasters, such as FEMA. Indeed, when FEMA became part of the DHS, its funding was reduced and it received less attention because the focus of the DHS has been on fighting terrorism, not on responding to natural disasters. In addition, the DHS did not actually unify all U.S. anti-terrorism efforts. The most important anti-terrorist agency are the Federal Bureau of Investigation, FBI, and the CIA, but neither is part of the DHS. Many believe that the number one problem in addressing terrorism is the failure of the FBI and CIA to exchange information with one another. To address this problem, President Bush created a terrorist threat integration center in addition to the DHS, the FBI, and the CIA. In 2004, Congress established the new office of the Director of the National Intelligence to coordinate the nation's intelligence effort. In 2005, President Bush appointed John Negroponte, 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 to be John Negroponte. John, to be the Director of National Intelligence to try once again to coordinate the nation's intelligence agencies. So I'm going to go back and try to read it. So the President Bush appointed John. So he appointed John to be the Director of the National Intelligence. Way to go, John. John is the director. In 2005, he was the Director of the National Intelligence, so the nation's intelligence agencies. So this position, however, has been difficult to establish. In 2010, President Obama named the fourth director in 5 years, General James R. Clapper. The authority of the director is often undercut by appointees who may have be closer to the president, including the director of the CIA and the National Security Advisor, making this a very difficult position to hold. Wow. All right. So now I'm gonna read a little bit about dealing with natural disasters. So as George H.W. Bush faced a tough re-election campaign in 1992, Hurricane Andrew struck southern Florida, destroying many communities south of Miami, Florida, leaving hundreds of thousands of people without power and without homes. Although the total death toll was only 65, the storm cost more than $25 billion in damage and losses. The Bush administration was widely criticized for not getting aid to the victims quickly enough, and the president was cheated for not putting in a personal appearance. So there's a word here in this paragraph I am unfamiliar with. I pronounce it cheated. It's spelled CHIDED. So I'm assuming that this is something that's negative. We're talking about a disaster and people aren't getting money fast enough. So I can imagine this word is not a positive word. However, I'm having a tough time pronouncing it. I've never heard it before, so I don't know the exact definition. So let's take a listen. Chide. It's chide. I said cheat. It's chide. CHIDE. And it means to scold or to rebuke, to chastise, to scold, to rebuke. So chide. So Bush was chided. He was chastised. He was rebuked. He was scolded. So for not putting in a personal appearance. Supposedly, FEMA was strengthened and improved after Hurricane Andrew. FEMA dealt competently with hundreds of natural disasters in the years that followed, including tornadoes, floods, and blizzards. However, in 2005, a year in which 5 major hurricanes made landfall in the United States, FEMA again proved unable to meet the challenges of a massive natural disaster. When Hurricane Katrina headed toward New Orleans, all authorities warned of a possible flooding situation. No one dreamed of flooding that will trap thousands of residents in their homes for a week or more and destroy whole neighborhoods in New Orleans. No one had planned to evacuate thousands of people with no transportation in their own or to house them for years after the storm. Again, FEMA was criticized for its slow response, as was President George W. Bush. The scope of this disaster was so large, and the relationship between the state and federal agencies involved so complex that FEMA could not effectively coordinate the rescue and relief efforts. Wow. What do y'all think about that? Hurricane Katrina. That wasn't very long ago. Wasn't very long ago at all. 2005. So natural man-made emergencies continue to test the ability of federal agency to respond. In 2010, an oil drill rig in the Gulf of Mexico exploded, triggering a massive oil spill. In 2010, a massive oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico. Again, within days, the media and local government officials were calling for faster and more effective federal government assistance, even though the technology for dealing with such a spill is only available in the petroleum industry. President Obama was accused of not visiting the region quickly enough and not demonstrating enough anger at the oil company. When Hurricane Sandy formed in the Caribbean in October 2012, weather scientists predicted that the very powerful and extraordinarily large storm might come up the east coast of the United States. Mindful of earlier events, FEMA and other local, state, and federal agencies began to plan before the storm came to the United States. Although downgraded to a tropical storm or superstorm, by the time it came ashore in New York, Sandy took more than 275 lives and caused an estimated $68 billion in damage. Thousands of people lost their home in New Jersey and New York. FEMA and other agencies were generally praised for their actions and for warning residents before the storm hit. Hurricane Katrina and Sandy illustrated a huge challenge faced by bureaucracies when dealing with natural disasters. So many agencies and level of government must be coordinated that sometimes responses are delayed and aid does not get to the victim in a timely way. Media coverage of these tragedies focused on the struggles of citizens, while the struggles of the bureaucracies take place in back rooms, and officials strive to find the right equipment and personnel to meet unique disasters. At times, no president can be successful in dealing with the public relation aspect of these events. Wow, what do you think about that? How do you guys respond to natural disasters? Do you guys ever have any disasters at your home? Like maybe there's a flood in your basement, or maybe you get your house get fire. Do you have any natural disasters that goes on in your home? How do you respond to those type of things? Staffing the bureaucracy. Explain how individuals get positions in the federal bureaucracy and discuss the history of attempts to reform that process. The two categories of bureaucrats are political appointees and civil servants. The president is able to make political appointments to most of the top jobs in the federal bureaucracy and can appoint ambassadors to foreign posts. The rest of the national government's employee belong to the civil service and obtain their jobs through a much more formal process. Political appointees. To fill the position listed in Plum Book, the president and the president's advisors solicit suggestions from politicians, business persons, and other prominent individuals. Appointments offer the president a way to pay off outstanding political debts. But the president must also consider such things as the candidate's work experience, intelligence, political affiliations, and personal characteristics. Presidents have differed in the importance they attach to appointing women and minorities to plum positions. Presidents often use ambassadorships to reward individuals for their campaign contribution. What's an ambassadorship? Not sure what that word is. I have heard of the word ambassador, but I've never heard of the word of ambassadorship. So I'm going to enter that here in my phone. So this is ambassador. So I'm going to ambassadorship. So it's a diplomatic official of the highest rank sent by one sovereign or state to another as its resident representative, ambassador, extraordinarily, and there's another word I'm unfamiliar with. Okay, so I'm going to try to pronounce this. I'm just going to spell it Plenipotentiary. 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 I think that's how you say it. I think that's it. Okay, so a diplomatic official of the highest rank sent by a government to represent it on a temporary mission as for negotiating treaty. Okay, so an example of an ambassador is a high-ranking official who travels to another country or to the United Nations in order to provide representation. So that is what an ambassador is. You travel to another country as a representation. So an ambassadorship is, let's see, that was an ambassadorship. So a diplomatic official of the highest rank sent by one sovereign or state as its resident representative. So that's the kind of the same thing. And this word here, I see it again, Plenipotentiary, plenipotentiary. Plenipotentiary. I think that's it. Let's see if that's all right. You guys remember how to spell it? Can you spell it out for me? Oh, my phone's not working. All right, so just keep that word in mind. We'll have to recover and go back to that. So even though the president has the power to appoint government officials, this does not mean an appointment will pass muster. Every potential nominee must undergo an FBI investigation and through screening. Such a process takes months, and after completing it, the appointees must be confirmed by the Senate. Sometimes individuals withdraw from the nomination process before confirmation. Others prove to be political problems for the administration only after confirmation. The aristocracy of the federal government. Looking up the word aristocracy. The highest class in certain societies, especially those holding hereditary titles or offices.
Aristocracy.
The highest rank in certain societies. Aristocracy. Especially those holding hereditary titles or office. The aristocracy of the federal government. Political appointees are, in some sense, the aristocracy of the federal government. Their powers, although formable on paper, are often exaggerated. Like the president, a political appointee will occupy her or his position for a comparatively brief time. They often leave office before the president's term actually ends. The average term of service for political appointees is less than 2 years. Additionally, the professional civil servants who make up the permanent civil service may not feel compelled to carry out their current boss's directives quickly because they know that he or she will not be around for very long. So they're very important. They have very important jobs. They're not there for a very long time, but they are part of the aristocracy of the federal government. So the difficulty in firing civil servants. This inertia is compounded by the fact that it is very difficult to discharge civil servants. Inertia, INERTIA. Inertia, a tendency to do nothing or to remain unchanged. We're reading about the difficulty in firing civil servants. This is part of the Bureaucracy. So inertia, a tendency to do nothing or to remain unchanged. This inertia is compounded by the fact that it is very difficult to discharge civil servants. In recent years, less than 0.1% of the federal employees have been fired for incompetence. Because discharged employees may appeal their dismissal, many months or even years can pass before the issue is resolved conclusively. The attempt to change the Veterans Administration hospitals was complicated by these rules, and many top-level employees first took administrative leave during the investigative process and then returned with their secure pensions. This occupational rigidity helps ensure that most political appointees, no matter how competent or driven, will not be able to exert much meaningful influence over the subordinates, let alone implement dramatic changes in the bureaucracy itself. Y'all get that? So we know that it's very difficult to discharge civil servants. Many top-level employees first took administrative leave during the investigation process and then retired with their secure pensions. So they're there for a while. If you retire with your pension, you're going to be there for a long time. All right. Okay, so the history of the Federal Civic Service. So when the federal government was formed in 1789, it boasted no career public servants. Its rank was composed of amateurs, almost all of them Federalists. When Thomas Jefferson took over as president, few people in his party were holding federal administrative jobs. So he fired more than 100 officials and replaced them with his own supporters. Then, in the next 25 years, as a growing body of federal administrators gained experience and expertise, they developed into professional public servants. These administrators stayed in office regardless of who was elected president. The bureaucracy had become a self-maintaining, long-term element within the government. To the victor belong the spoils. When Andrew Jackson took over the White House in 1828, he could not believe how many appointed officials appointed before he became president, that is, were overtly hostile toward him and his Democratic Party. Because the bureaucracy was reluctant to carry out his program, Jackson did the obvious. He fired federal officials, more than he had all his predecessors combined. The spoil system and application of the principle that to a victor belong the spoils became the standard method of filling federal positions. Whenever a new president was elected from a different party, the staffing of the federal government would almost completely turn over. So spoil system means the awarding of government jobs to political supporters and friends. All right. So the Civil Service Reform Act of 1883, Jackson's spoil system. So this is something that Jackson created. They didn't support him. They didn't support what he was doing. So he fired them and he put whoever he wanted to be in office. That's the spoil system. This was created by Jackson. So Andrew Jackson was president in 1828. So the Civil Service Reform Act of 1883. So the Civil Service Reform Act. So years later, so let's do the math, 1828. See here, 1828 minus 1883. You guys got it? All right, I have 55. So 55 years later. So Jackson's spoil system survived. So they're still using this system 55 years later for decades. So, but it became increasingly corrupt. So also, as the size of the bureaucracy increased by 300% between 1851 and 1881, the cry for civil service reform grew louder. Reformers looked to the examples of the several European countries, Germany in particular, which had established a professional civil service that operated under a merit system in which job appointments were based on competitive examinations. In 1883, the Pendleton Act and the Civil Service Reform was passed, placing the first limits on the spoil system. The act was established the president of employment on the basis of open competitive examinations and created the Civil Service Commission to administer the personnel service. So the Pendleton Act is a Civil Service Reform Act. The Civil Service Reform Act. And so we said that that act actually became increasingly corrupt. So the Pendleton, Pendleton, Pendleton Act, which is the Civil Service Reform Act, the act that established the principle of employment on the basis of merit and created Civil Services Commission to administer the personnel service. Okay, so the personnel service. Y'all know what that is, personnel service. So personnel is people employed in an organization or engaged in an organized undertaking such as military service. We love our military people. Do y'all know they get so much money? Like they get a lot of money. If you're in the military, even if you're a veteran, like they make sure they take care of their veterans, they take care of their people. Military, gotta love them. So later, laws, amendments, and executive orders, however, increased to coverage more than 90% of the federal employees. The effects of these reforms were felt at all levels of government. The Supreme Court strengthened the civil service system in Elrod versus Burns in 1976 and Branty versus Finkel in 1980. In these cases, the court used the amendment to forbid government officials from discharging or threatening to discharge public employees solely for not being supporters of the political party in power unless party affiliation is an appropriate requirement for the position. So additionally, enhancements to the civil service system were added in Rutan versus Republican Party of Illinois in 1990. The court ruling effectively prevented the use of partisan political considerations as the basis for hiring, promoting, or transferring most public employees. An exception was permitted, however, for senior policymaking positions, which usually go to the officials who will support the program of the elected leaders. The Civil Service Reform Act of 1978. In 1978, the Civil Service Reform Act abolished the Civil Service Commission and created two new federal agencies to perform its duties. To administer the civil service law, rules, and regulations, the Act created an Office of Personnel Management, OPM, which is empowered to recruit, interview, and test potential government workers and determine who should be hired. The OPM makes recommendations to the individual agencies as to which person meets the standard, typically the top 3 applicants for a position, and the agencies then decide whom to hire. To oversee promotions, employees' rights, and other employment matters, the Act created the Merit System Protection Board, MSPB, which evaluates charges of wrongdoings, hear employees' appeals and agency decisions, and can order corrective actions against agencies and employees. Federal employees and political campaigns. In 1933, the President Franklin D. Roosevelt set up his New Deal. A virtual army of civil servants was hired to staff the numerous new agencies that were created. Because the individuals who worked in these agencies owned their jobs to the Democratic Party, it seemed natural for them to campaign for Democratic candidates. The Democratic controlling Congress in the mid-1930s did not object, but in 1938, a coalition of conservative Democrats and Republicans took control of Congress and forced through the Hatch Act, a Political Activities Act of 1939, which prohibited federal employees from actively participating in the political management of campaigns. It also forbade the use of federal authority to use influence, nomination, and elections, and outlawed the use of the bureaucratic rank to pressure federal employees to make political contributions. So in this paragraph here, there was a word that I heard before, and I've actually looked up the definition, and I don't quite remember what it is. And that word is spelled coalition, coalition. Y'all know what that word means?
Coalition.
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 Coalition. All right, so that is an alliance for combined action, especially a temporary alliance of a political party forming a government or of states. So alliance is a union or an association formed between mutual benefits, especially between countries and organizations. So we have an alliance for combined action. So an alliance, union for combined action. All right, so especially temporary alliance, temporary combining or association for mutual benefit. All right.
Coalition.
Coalition. So what about that? So coalition of conservative Democrats and Republicans took control of Congress and forced through the Hatch Act, a Political Activities Act of 1939. So we see the Republicans and Democrats coming together, working together for mutual benefit. All right. And so it says they took over Congress. We know Congress is what? Legislative, executive, judicial. All of that makes up Congress. And we have Democrats and Republicans that are what? They're working together in these arenas. Okay. So the Hatch Act created a controversy that lasted for decades. Many contended that the act deprived federal employees of their First Amendment freedoms of speech and association. In 1972, a federal district court declared it unconstitutional. The Supreme Court, all right, however, reaffirmed the challenged portion of the act in 1973, starting that the government's interest in preserving a nonpartisan civil service was so great that the prohibitions should remain. Okay, prohibitions. Prohibitions. I know pro means before. Prohibition. The action of forbidding something, especially by law. Forbidding something. Prohibition. Nonpartisan.
Nonpartisan.
All right, so I pronounced that word incorrectly. It's nonpartisan.
Nonpartisan.
Nonpartisan. Nonpartisan. Nonpartisan. Not based on partisan, especially toward any particular political group. Partisan. Nonpartisan. Not biased.
Partisan.
Partisan, a strong supporter of a party, cause, or person. That's important. So if you're a strong supporter of the Republicans, you can be classified as a partisan. A member of an armed group formed to fight secretly against an occupying force, in particular, one operating enemy-occupied Yugoslavia, Italy, and other parts of Eastern Europe and the World War II. Okay, so I have a couple definitions here. This one is about a member of an armed group formed to fight secretly against an occupying force. And then I have another one that talks about being a strong supporter of a party, cause, or person. So now I have the same word, same spelling, two definitions that are like not the same. And so now I need to plug this into the text here where it talks about that and try to figure out which one makes sense. So if you go back in the reading, okay, so I'm just trying to find it. Okay, here it is. So we're talking about federal employees and political campaign. So, I mean, just knowing that, it makes sense to probably be the first one, a strong supporter of a party or cause. But let's still try to take a look here. It says many contended that the act deprived federal employees of the First Amendment, freedom of speech, and association. In 1972, a federal district court declared unconstitutional. The Supreme Court, however, reaffirmed the challenges portion of the act in 1973, stating that the government's interest in preserving a nonpartisan civil service was of great that the prohibitions should remain. So maybe it's talking about the other one. Maybe it's a member of an armed group formed to fight secretly against the occupying force. Okay, so 20 years later, Congress addressed the criticism by passing the Federal Employees Political Activities Act of 1993. The act was amended. The act which amended the hatch allowed federal employees to run for office. Oh, now we're talking about running for office in a non-partisan election. So maybe it is the first one then. A strong supporter of a party, cause, or person. Do you guys know what amended means? AMENDED. Can you imagine being in class and not being able to use your phone and you're trying to follow along with the instructor and you're just like, oh my gosh, I have no idea what you're talking about because I don't know that word? That was me. Imagine reading an article, a long article, a new article, unfamiliar things, unfamiliar words, and you're just like, I have no idea what I'm reading. Like, I don't even know how to pronounce it. And you don't have the tools that you need in order to be successful. I think that students these days should have electronics to help support them in their educational learning. I really do. I think that they should have access to those things. All right. So I'm looking up this word, amended. So that means make minor changes in a text in order to make it fairer, more accurate, and more up to date. To revise, to alter, to change. So the act was amended. The act softened the 1939 Act in several ways. Among other things, the 1993 Act allowed federal employees to run for office in non-partisan elections, particularly in voter registration drives, make campaign contributions to political organization, and campaign for candidates in partisan elections. So modern tips at bureaucratic reforms. Discuss some of the critics of large bureaucracies and describe several types of bureaucratic reform. As long as the federal bureaucracy exists, attempts to make it more open, efficient, and responsive to the needs of the U.S. citizens will continue. The most important actual and proposed reforms in the last several decades include sunshine and sunset laws, privatization incentives for efficiency, and more protection for so-called whistleblowers. Sunshine laws before the September 11th. In 1976, Congress enacted the Government and the Sunshine Act. The Sunshine Act is a law that requires all committees, directed federal agencies to conduct their business regularly in public sessions. So a law that requires all committee-directed federal agencies to conduct their businesses regularly in public sessions. So it required for the first time that all multi-headed federal agencies headed by a committee instead of an individual, hold their meetings regularly in public session. The bill defined meetings as almost any gathering, formal or informal, of agency members, including a conference telephone call. The only exception to this rule of openness are discussions of matters such as court proceedings or personnel problems. And these exceptions are specifically listed in the bill. Sunshine laws now exist at all levels of government. Information disclosure. Sunshine laws are consistent with the policy of information disclosure supported by the government for decades. Beginning in 1960, several consumers protection laws have required that certain information be disclosed to consumers when purchasing homes, borrowing funds, and so on. In 1966, the federal government passed the Freedom of Information Act, which required federal government agencies, with certain exceptions, to disclose to individuals or their request any information about them contained in government files. So this is information disclosure. Policy information disclosure supported by the government for decades. Beginning in the 1960s, several customer protection laws have required that certain information be disclosed to consumers when purchasing homes, borrowing funds, and so on. In 1966, the federal government passed the Freedom of Information Act, which required federal government agencies, with certain exceptions, to disclose to individuals on their request any information about them contained in government files. So curbs on the information disclosure. Since September 11th in 2001, the trend toward the government and sunshine and information disclosure had been reversed at both the federal and state levels. Within weeks after September 11, 2001, numerous federal agencies removed hundreds, if not thousands, of documents from websites, public libraries, and reading rooms found in various federal government departments. Information contained in some of the documents, including diagrams and power plants and pipelines, structural details of dams, and safety plans for chemical plants. The military was immediately started restricting information about its current and planned activities, as did the FBI. These agencies were conducted that terrorists could not use this information to plan attack. The federal government pioneered the withdrawal of information from public view, but state and local governments were quick to jump on board wagon. The state and local governments control and supervise police forces, dams, electricity sources, water supplies. It is not surprising that many state and local governments follow in the footsteps of the federal government in curbing access to certain public records and information. Most local agencies, however, do involve the public emergency planning. Sunset law. It has often been suggested that the federal government be subject to sunset legislation, which places government programs on a definite schedule for congressional consideration, unless Congress specifically reauthorized a particular federal operated program at the end of the designated period. It is also automatically terminated, that is, its sunsets. Although this idea was first campaigned by Franklin D. Roosevelt in the 1930s, it has not been adopted by Congress. Texas and Alabama have sunset laws that affect all state agencies. Privatization. Another approach to the bureaucratic reform is privatization. 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 I want to see how that sounds on here. I'm sorry. Excuse me. Privatation. No, I spelled it wrong. Privatization. Privatization. Let's see how it sounds pronounced. Privatization. The transfer of a business, industry, or service from public to private ownership and control. Another approach of the bureaucratic reform is privatization, which occurs when government services are replaced by services from private sector. For example, the government might contract with private firms to operate prisons. Supporters and privatizations argue that some services could be provided more efficiently by the private sector. Another scheme is to furnish vouchers to clients and allow a service. For example, instead of supplying housing, the government could offer vouchers that recipients could not use to pay for housing in private-owned buildings. The privatization on contracting out strategy has been most successful at the local level. Municipalities can form contracts with private companies for such things as trash collection, This approach is not all cure all. This approach is not a cure all. However, as many functions, particularly on the national level, cannot be contracted out in any meaningful way. The federal government could not contract out most of the Defense Department's functions to private firms. Nonetheless, the U.S. military has contracted out many services in Iraq and elsewhere, as discussed in Beyond Our Borders. So privatization is the replacement of government services with services provided by private firms. Incentives for efficiency and productivity. An increasing number of the state governments are beginning to experiment with a variety of schemes to run their operations more efficiently and capably. They focus on maximizing the efficiency and productivity of government workers by providing incentives for improved performances. Some of the most promising measures have included such tactics as permitting agencies that do not spend their entire budget to keep some of the differences and rewarding employees with performance-based bonuses. So this is it says Beyond Our Borders here. It's talking a little bit about the bureaucracies around the world face Ebola. So Ebola was a big deal. Here I have, all right, so it looks like a refugee camp here. The Ebola isolation ward in the Mapoko refugee camp. So in the late 2013, cases of Ebola, a deadly virus, was reported in West Africa. So that took place in West Africa. It was not immediately clear whether these were isolated cases or that the disease was being spread across the region. Ebola, which is caused by a virus, is easily spread to those who touch someone with the illness and is fatal almost 50% of the time. Within 2 years, the reported death toll was 11,322 out of possibly 28,000 cases. For the countries involved in the outbreak, Guinea, Liberia, and Sierra Leone, the impact of the disease will be felt for decades in terms of broken families, economic losses, and the loss of large numbers of healthcare workers who died of the disease. So Ebola was another like a deadly disease that spread in Africa. And so the west part of Africa, to be exact. And so this was a tragic time for those that were in Africa. And now here in the United States, we faced COVID-19, which was a very awful disease that spread around the world, which happened to be a pandemic, and a lot of people died, and it's a tragic time. And now at work, I still have to wear my face mask, and I'm washing my hands thoroughly. But this is tragic, you know. We have to still live, and you still have to go on, you know, every day, even if you lost a loved one, or, you know, maybe you lost your pet. You still have to live and go on in life. And thank God for counselors, and thank God for prayers, and for those that took part in making face masks for us, and whatever oxygen tank we might have needed, and just all the helping workers. Just thank God for those that took part in taking care of their health, protecting themselves and protecting others, and just following instruction on how to go about fighting back the disease. Just very thankful for those, and we have to keep on living. So the Government Performance and Results Act. At the federal level, the Government Performance and Results Act of 1997 was designed to improve efficiency in the federal workforce. The act required that all government agencies except the CIA described in new goals and established methods for determining whether those goals are met. The performance-based budgeting implemented by President George W. Bush took this result-oriented approach a step further. In the Bush administration, agencies were given specific performances criteria to meet, and Office of Management and Budget rated each agency to determine how well it performed. Additional efforts to improve efficiency have included bonus pay and employees in some departments of the federal government. Bureaucracy has changed little. Observers disagree over whether the government can meet the demands of a complex economy and diverse nation. Consequently, the government must become more responsive to cope with the increasing demands placed on it. Political scientists Joel Auerbach and Bert Rockman took issue with this contention. They argued that the bureaucracy has changed significantly over time in response to the demands of various presidential administrations. In their opinion, many of the problems attributed to the bureaucracy are, in fact, a result of the political decision-making process. Therefore, attempts to reinvent government by reforming the bureaucracy are misguided. Others have suggested that the problem lies with the people who run bureaucratic organizations. According to some scholars, we need to be reinvented is not the machinery of government, but public officials. After each election, new appointees of the bureaucratic position may find problems managing complex multi-million-dollar enterprises, yet they often are untrained for their jobs. According to these authors, civil service career executives who head federal agencies do a better job than the amateurs appointed by the president. Serving costs through e-government. All right, so many contend that the communication revolution brought about by the internet has not only improved the efficiency of the government agencies' delivered services to the public, but has also reduced the cost of government. Agencies can now communicate with members of the public as well as other agencies via email. Additionally, every federal agency now has a website citizens can access to find information about agency services instead of calling or appearing in person at a regional agency office. Taxes and withholdings are deposited electronically, and payments such as Social Security benefits are transferred electronically. Since 2003, federal agencies have also been required by the Government Paperwork Eliminated Act of 1998 to use e-commerce whenever it is practical to do so and will save on cost. So e-commerce is a word I am not very familiar with. I want to say it's like email. I don't know why. I guess because there's an E. So it's e-commerce, commerce, e-commerce. And so
E-commerce.
e-commerce. I said e-commerce. It's e-commerce. So
E-commerce.
e-commerce. So commercially transaction conducted electronically on the internet. So commercially transactions conducted electronically on the internet. E-commerce. So if you buy something on the internet, you transfer e-commerce. Okay. So we have, there's so many benefits with electronics today, like how things are. It definitely makes things a lot quicker, easier. Yeah. So that's awesome. Helping out the whistleblowers. The term whistleblower as applied to the federal bureaucracy, has a special meaning. So, whistleblower is someone who brings to public attention gross governmental inefficiencies or an illegal action. So, the term whistleblower, as applied by the federal bureaucracy, has a special meaning. It is someone who blows the whistle on a gross governmental inefficiency or illegal action. Whistleblowers may be clerical workers, managers, or even specialists such as scientists. Laws protecting whistleblowers. In 1978, Civil Service Reform Act prohibits reprisals against whistleblowers by their superiors, and it sets up the Merit System Protection Board as part of this protection. So many federal agencies also have toll-free hotlines that employees can use anonymously to report bureaucratic waste and inappropriate behavior. Further protection for whistleblowers was provided in 1989 when Congress passed the Whistleblower Protection Act. The act established an independent agency, the Office of Special Counsel, OSC, to investigate complaints brought by government employees who have been demoted, fired, or otherwise sanctioned by reporting government fraud or waste. Some states that federal laws encourage employees to blow the whistle on their employees' wrongfully action by providing monetary incentives to the whistleblowers. At the federal level, the False Claims Act of 1989 allows a whistleblower who has disclosed information against a fraud against the U.S. government to receive a monetary award if the government chooses to prosecute the case of wins. The whistleblower receives between 15 and 25% of the proceeds. If the government declines to intervene, the whistleblower can bring suit on behalf of the government, and if the suit is successful, will receive between 25 to 30% of the proceeds. The problem continues. Despite these endeavors to help whistleblowers, little evidence indicates that potential whistleblowers truly have received more protection. More than 40% of the employees who turn to the OSC assistance in a recent 3-year period stated that they were no longer employees of the government agency on which they blow their whistle. Most have already retired. The Supreme Court placed restrictions on lawsuits in 2006 case Garcetti versus Caballos, which involved an assistant district attorney, Richard Ceballos, who wrote the memo asking if the country's sheriff deputy had lied in such warrant affidavit, AFFIDAVIT, affidavit.
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 Affidavit. A written statement confirmed by oath or affirmation for the use of evidence in court. Affidavit. 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 Ceballos, I hope I'm saying his name correctly, CEBALLOS. Ceballos claimed that he was subsequently demoted or denied a promotion for trying to expose the lie. The outcome of the case turned on the interpretation of an employee's right to freedom of speech, whether it included the right to criticize an employment-related action. In a close 5-4 and controversial decision, the Supreme Court held that when public employees make statements relating to their official duties, they are not speaking as citizens for the First Amendment purpose. The court deemed that when he wrote his memo, Ceballos was speaking as an employee, not a citizen, and was thus subject to his employer's disciplinary actions. The ruling affects millions of governmental employees. The Obama administration was particularly concerned with the national security implication of information leaked to journalists. Although some federal employees might believe that they are whistleblowers, the Obama administration prosecuted whistleblowers under the Espionage Act of 1917. Which makes it a federal crime for federal employees to give aid to our enemies. So espionage, Espionage.
Espionage.
Espionage. I said espionage. It's espionage. The practice of spying or using spies, typically by governments to obtain political and military information. Espionage.
Espionage.
Espionage. Espionage. The Espionage Act of 1917, which makes a federal crime for federal employees to give aid to our enemies. This legislation was only used 3 times between 1719 and 2008, but after President Obama took office, 6 cases was prosecuted against federal workers, imposing a chill on relationships between federal employees and the press. The bureaucrats and politicians and policymakers. Bureaucrats and politicians and policymakers. Describe the tools and powers that bureaucratic agencies have to shape policies and regulations. So tools and powers that bureaucratic agencies have to shape policies and regulations. Because Congress is unable to oversee the day-to-day administration of its programs, it must delegate certain powers to administrative agencies. Congress delegated the powers to implement legislation to agencies through enabling legislation. For example, the Federal Trade Commission was created by the Federal Trade Commission Act of 1914. The Equal Employment Opportunity Commission was created by the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And the Occupational Safety and Healthy Administration was created by Occupational Safety and Health Act of 1970. The enabling legislation generally specifies the name, purpose, composition, functions, and powers of the agencies. So enabling legislation is a statute enacted by Congress that authorizes the creation of an administrative agency and specifies the name, purpose, composition, function, and powers of the agency being created. So in theory, the agencies should administer laws passed by Congress. Congress makes the laws. So if Congress passes the laws, then it says here that the agencies should administer those laws. So laws are often drafted in such vague and general terms, however, that they provide relatively little guidance to agencies' administrators as to how the laws should be implemented. This means that the agencies must decide how best to carry out the wishes of Congress. This role requires the agencies to formulate administrative rules, regulations, but it also forces the agencies to become an unelected policymaker. The rule-making environment. Rulemaking does not occur in a vacuum. The EPA might decide to implement the new law through a technical regulation on factory emission. This proposed regulation is published in the Federal Register so that interested parties would have an opportunity to comment on it. Individuals and companies that oppose the rule or parts of it might then try to convince the EPA to revise or redraft the regulation. Some parties might try to persuade the agency to withdraw the proposed regulation altogether. In any event, the EPA would consider these comments in drafting the final version of the regulation following the expiration of the comment period. So the EPA would consider these comments in drafting the final version of the regulation following the expiration of the comment period. All right, so waiting periods and court challenges. Once the final regulation has been published in the Federal Register, the rule can be enforced after 60 days waiting period. So after a 60-day waiting period, the rule can be enforced. During that period, businesses, individuals, and state and local governments can ask Congress to overturn the regulation. After that 60-day period has lapsed, the regulation can still be challenged in court by a party having a direct interest in the rule, such as a company that expects to incur significant cost in complying with it. The company could argue that the rule misinterprets the application law and goes beyond the agency statutory purview. An allegation by the company that the EPA made a mistake in judgment probably would not be enough to convince the court to throw out the rule. The company instead would have to demonstrate that the rule was arbitrary and capricious. So we need to know arbitrary and capricious. Or maybe I need to know that. Y'all know what that is? What's arbitrary?
Arbitrary.
Based on a random choice or personal whim rather than any reason or system. What's capricious? Given to sudden and unaccountable changes of mood or behavior. All right, so controversies. Controversies. Y'all know what that is? What is controversies? I know, I think it's like opposite. Like if you're in an argument, you have controversy, like you don't agree. Let's see what it means. Disagreement. Typically when prolonged, public, and heated. So controversies. How agencies implement, administer, and enforce legislation was resulted in controversies. Decisions made by agencies charged with administering an Endangered Species Act have led to protests from farmers, ranchers, and others whose economic interests have been harmed. For example, the government decided to cut off the flow of irrigation water from Klamath Lake in Oregon in the summer of 2001. The action, which affected irrigation and water for more than 1,000 farmers in southern Oregon, and northern California, was undertaken to save endangered suckerfish and salmon. It was believed that the lake's water level was so low that further use of the water for irrigation would harm these fish. The result of this decision was devastating for many farmers. One of the agencies that seemed to be the most sensitive in the change was presidential administration and the Environmental Protection Agency. Created by Congress in 1970, Congress has passed several laws to improve air quality in the United States, giving the EPA the authority to carry out this legislation. Presidents differ, however, in how they interpret these congressional mandates. During the George W. Bush administration, the EPA issued decisions that weakened the enforcement of air pollution laws. In 1999, several environmental groups petitioned the EPA to set new standards for automobiles to reduce greenhouse gas emission. In 2003, during the Bush administration, the EPA refuses to do so, claiming that it did not have the legal authority to do this. States that pass laws regulating automobiles in their own areas use the EPA. In 2008, the Supreme Court ruled that the EPA could not refuse to access environmental hazards and issued appropriate regulations. As Justice John Paul Stevens wrote, "This is the constitutional design. EPA has refused to comply with this clear statutory command. This was an unusual situation in that the states actually challenged a regulatory agency to issue stronger regulations. Often, challenges to regulatory agencies are intended to weaken new regulations. The Obama administration took a much firmer stand on the enforcement of air pollution regulations, while committed to the passage of a new energy bill that will reduce the United States contribution to greenhouse gases. By spring of 2010, it seemed that major new legislation might not pass quickly. The EPA issued new gas mileage requirement and new rule regulating tailpipe emission for cars and trucks in April 2010. A Republican-led attempt in the Senate to veto these new regulations was defeated in June of that year. The EPA also issued new regulations for coal mining and for emission from coal burning power plants. With the inauguration of President Trump, support for enhanced enforcement and environmental rules dissipated overnight. Many of the Obama air rules have been reversed through executive orders, and others are pending further study by the Trump administration. So, negotiated rulemaking. Since 1945, companies, environmentalists, and other special interest groups have challenged government regulations in court. In the 1980s, however, the sheer wastefully of attempting to regulate through litigation became more and more apparent. Today, a growing number of federal agencies encourage businesses and public interest groups to become directly involved in drafting regulations. Agencies hope that such participation may help prevent later courtroom battles over the meaning, applicability, and legal effect of regulations. So looking up the word litigation, litigation, litigation.
Litigation.
The process of taking legal action. All right. How y'all doing? Okay, so negotiated rulemaking, right? Negotiated rulemaking. So today, a growing number of federal agencies encourage businesses and public interest groups to become directly involved in drafting regulations. Agencies hope that such participation may help prevent later courtroom battles over the meaning. What do y'all think about that? Do you think it will make a difference if we get public interest involved in some of the changes that's being made? What about the next generation that comes up in the world that might have new problems, and they might see, okay, now we have these new problems, so now we don't want this anymore. We want this, or we want that instead. I mean, do you think that, will we still have problems if we allow the public interest to be involved? Will we still want to make changes as time goes on? Or will we want to keep it the same? Congress formally approved negotiated rulemaking in the Negotiated Rulemaking Act of 1990. The act authorizes agencies to allow those who will be affected by a new rule to participate in the new rule drafting process. If an agency chooses to engage in negotiated rulemaking, it must publish in Federal Register the subject of scope of the rule to be developed, the parties affected significantly by the rule, and other information. Representatives of the affected groups and other interest parties then may apply to be members of the negotiated committee. The agency is represented on the committee, but a neutral third party, not the agency, presides over the proceedings. Once the committee members have reached agreement on the terms of the proposed rule, a notice is published in the Federal Register, followed by a period for comments by any person or organization interested in the proposal rule. Negotiated rulemaking is often practiced under the condition that the participants promise not to challenge in court the outcome of any agreement to which they were a party. Yeah. So I think it's cool that, they're like, okay, we don't want you in court. Y'all work it out. Okay. I think sometimes it's nice to have like a mediator, like a person who can step in between and say, okay, but I think it's also nice for us to have that responsibility to know how to work things out. If you might have like some other issues that might be larger or bigger issue, more important. It's like, I don't know how to really say it, but it's a problem. Obviously, it's affecting you and it's affecting your environment. So in that moment, but it's like, okay, y'all work that out. Like, what do you think about that? Okay, so bureaucrats are policymakers. Theories of public administration once assumed that bureaucrats do not make policy decisions, but only implement the laws and policies promulgated by the president and legislative bodies. Promulgated. Promulgated. Promulgated.
Promulgate.
Promulgate. Promulgated. Promulgate. Promote or make widely known an idea or cause. Put a law or decree into effect by official proclamation. Theories of public administration once assumed that bureaucrats do not make policy decisions, but only implement the laws and policies promulgated by the president and legislative bodies. A more realistic view, now held by most bureaucrats and elected officials, is that the agencies and departments of government play important roles in policy making. Elected officials is that the agencies and government play important roles in policy making. Many government rules, regulations, and programs are in fact initiated by bureaucrats based on their expertise and scientific studies. How the law passed by Congress eventually is translated into concrete action, from the forms to be filled out to decisions about who gets the benefit, usually is determined within each agency or department. Even the evaluation of whether a policy is achieved, its purpose usually is based on studies commissioned and interpreted by the agency administering the program. The bureaucracy's policymaking role has often been depicted by what traditionally has been called the iron triangle. Recently, concepts of an issue network has been viewed as a more accurate description of the policymaking process. So that an iron triangle is a three-way alliance among legislators, bureaucrats, and interest groups to make or preserve policies that benefit their respective interests. So I have an iron triangle, like there's a picture I can show y'all if y'all care to look. So there's the triangle. All right, that's an iron triangle, and it's equilateral. Notice it's not an isosceles triangle, it's not an acute triangle, it's equilateral. Iron triangles. In the past, scholars often describe the bureaucracy's role in the policymaking process by using the concepts of an iron triangle, a three-way alliance among legislators in Congress, bureaucrats, and interest groups. Consider as an example the development of the agricultural policy. Congress, as one component of the triangle, includes two major committees concerned with agriculture policy: the House Committee on Agriculture and the Senate Committee on Agriculture, Nutrition, and Forestry. The Department of Agriculture, the second component of the triangle, has more than 95,000 employees, plus thousands of contractors and consultants. Agriculture interest groups, the third component of the Iron Triangle in agriculture policymaking, includes many large and powerful associations such as American Farm Bureau Federation, the National Cattlemen's Association, and the Corn Growers Association. These three components of the Iron Triangle work together, formally and informally, to create a policy. And we know that when we have different people such as these that come together and work together, they form an alliance. They're an alliance, and that's a new word that we, or at least I, had to go back and revise and figure out what it meant. That's what that is. That's an alliance. They're working together for a mutual benefit. Isn't that great? So read the people here again. We have, let's see, it says, all right, so large and powerful associations such as American Farm Bureau Federation, the National Cattlemen Association, and the Corn Growers Association. Awesome. So the federal, for example, the various agriculture interest groups lobby Congress to develop policies that benefit their interests. Members of Congress cannot afford to ignore the wishes of interest groups because they are potentially sources of voter support and campaign contributions. The legislators in Congress also work closely with the Department of Agriculture, which in implementing a policy can develop rules that benefit, or at least do not hurt, certain industries or groups. The Department of Agriculture, in turn, supports policies to enhance the department budget and powers. In this way, according to theory, agriculture policy is created that the benefits all three components of the Iron Triangle. I want to go back to the Iron Triangle because, I like pictures, and they have this nice picture here of the triangle. And I just kind of want to dive and just kind of look at it a little bit. So at the very top of the triangle, it says Congress substantive committees. And then on the bottom left, it says the federal department or agency. And on the right, it says interest groups and lobbyists. And then in between, there's some information. So controls the budget, helps agency and its constituents. So the federal department or agency and the Congress substantive committees, they work together. So it says the federal department of agency, the agency helps the constituents, and then it says for the Congress substantive committee, they control the budget. So they kind of work together. The federal department of agency works with the interest group and lobbyists by supports the constituents, and the interest groups and lobbyists supports the federal department agency. So groups supplies information. So one supports the constituents, and then the group supplies the information. And then the agency helps the constituents, and then another, it controls the budgets. And then there's one where the Congress substantive committee controls the regulations and subsidies, and then the interest group and lobbyists give the campaign funds and support. So it's like they're working together. You help me, I help you. We work together. We can form an iron triangle. And I think that's really cool how they work together. Issue network, for example, is a simplified picture of how the iron triangle works. With the growth in the complexity of government, policy making also has become more complicated. The bureaucracy is larger. Congress has more committees and subcommittees. The interest groups are more powerful than ever. Although iron triangles still exist, often they are inadequate as descriptions of how policy is actually made. Frequently, different interest groups concerned about the certain area of policy have conflicting demands, making agency decisions difficult. Additionally, divided government in some years has meant that departments are sometimes pressured by the president to take one approach and by Congress to take another. Many scholars now use the term issue network to describe the policy-making process. An issue network consists of individuals or organizations that support a particular policy position on the environment, taxation, consumer safety, or some other issue. Typically, it includes legislator and or their staff members, interest groups, bureaucrats, scholars, and other experts, and representatives from the media. Members of a particular issue network work together to influence the president, members of Congress, administrative agencies, and the court to affect public policy on a specific issue. Each policy issue may involve conflicting positions taken by two or more issue networks. During the Trump administration, the issue network concerned with energy policy, trade policy, and tax policy ramped up their efforts to be influential in legislation favored by the president. So, issue network is a group of individuals or organizations which may consist of legislators and legislative staff members, interest group leaders, bureaucrats, the media, scholars, and other experts that supports a particular policy position on a given issue. So, we have another section here, congressional control of bureaucracy. Let's do it. So this is the last section. All right, let's get into it. So congressional, anytime you have congressional, it relates to who? Congress. Congressional relates to Congress. Control, we got to have control. Why do we need control? We like control. We like order. We like structure. We like things where we know what's going to happen next, right? We like to know. We need system. We need law. We need order, right? We need control, right? If I didn't have control, oh my gosh, what would I do if I didn't have no governmental control, no law? All right, so congressional control, Congress control of bureaucracy. So analyze the relationship between Congress, its committees, interest groups, and the bureaucracy. Many political pundits doubt whether Congress can meaningfully control the federal bureaucracy. Nevertheless, Congress does not have some means of exerting control. So ways Congress does control the bureaucracy. These commentators forget that Congress specifies in an agency enabling legislation, the powers of the agency, and the parameters within which it can operate. Additionally, Congress has the power of the purse and theoretically could refuse to authorize or appropriate funds for a particular agency after allegations were made that the Internal Revenue Science IRS targeted conservative political groups. Funding was reduced for that agency. Congress does have the legal authority to decide whether or not to fund administrative agencies. Congress can also exercise oversight over agencies through investigations and hearings. Congressional committees conduct investigations and hold hearings to oversee an agency's actions, reviewing them to ensure compliance with congressional intentions. The agency officers and employees can be ordered to testify before a committee about the details of an action. Through these oversight activities, especially in the questions and comments of members of the House or Senate during the hearings, Congress indicates its position on specific programs and issues. Congress can ask the GAO to investigate particular agencies' actions as well. The Congressional Budget Office, CBO, also conducts oversight studies. The results of a GAO or CBO study may encourage Congress to hold further hearings and or make changes in the law. All right, so I kind of want to go back because I kind of stumbled a little bit. The ands and the ors, I kind of like jumbled over that a little bit. So we're talking about Congress. We're talking about them having control. They have control over reducing money if they want to, stop money from coming. All like they can do that because they're Congress. So congressional committees conduct investigations and hold hearings to oversee an agency's action, reviewing them to ensure compliance with congressional intentions. The agency officers and employees can be ordered to testify before the committee about the details of an action. Through these oversight activities, especially in the questions and comments of members of the House or Senate during the hearings, Congress indicates its position on specific programs and issues. Congress can ask the GAO to investigate particular agencies as well. The Congressional Budget Office, CBO, also conducts oversight studies. The results of the GAO or CBO study may encourage Congress to hold further hearings or make changes in the law. So even if a law is not changed explicitly by Congress, however, the views expressed in any investigation and hearing are taken seriously by agency officials who often act on those views. In 1996, Congress passed the Congressional Review Act, which created special procedures that can be employed to express congressional disapproval of particular agency actions. Between 1996 and 2006, the congressional review process was employed only 8 times, but in the first year of the Trump administration, it was successfully invoked 15 times. So we have 96 to 2016 is how many years apart? 20 years. 20 years. So between that time frame, 1996 and 2016, so 20 years, the congressional review process was employed only 8 times. In the first year of the Trump administration, it was successfully invoked 15 times. So the GAO and the CBO do you guys know what GAO is? All right, we know CBO. I have it here in front of me. Congressional Budget Office. All right. So you have to go back to that one. So reasons why Congress cannot easily oversee the bureaucracy. Despite the powers just described, the theory of congressional control over the bureaucracy suggests that Congress cannot possibly oversee all of the bureaucracy. Consider 2 possible approaches of the congressional control: the police patrol and the fire alarm approach. Certain congressional activities, such as annual budget hearings, fall under the police patrol approach. This regular review occasionally catches some deficiencies in the bureaucracy's job performance, but it usually fails to detect most problems. In contrast, the firearm approach is more likely to discover gross inadequacies in the bureaucracy job performance. In this approach, Congress and its committees react to scandal, citizens' disappointments, and massive negative publicity by launching a full-scale investigation into whatever agency is suspected of wrongdoing. In 2014, newspapers reports of veterans who could not get appointed or treatment at Veterans Administration hospitals triggered special investigators and ongoing congressional hearings. Fire alarm investigations, which will not catch all problems, but they will alert bureaucracies that they need to clean up their procedures before a problem arises in their own agencies. Again, they take care of their veterans. If you're not paying their veterans, oh, this is serious. We take good care of our veterans. So shout out to those that are for the veterans. They take care of them for sure. So that completes the chapter of bureaucracy. Hooray! So we made it through. Thank y'all so much for listening. I do have a chapter summary. So if you want to stick around and go through the chapter summary. All right. So I hope I'm doing a well enough job. I like to think so. What do you think? All right, so the chapter summary. So 13.1, bureaucracies are hierarchical organizations characterized by a division of labor and extensive procedural rules. Bureaucracy is the primary form of organization of most major corporations and universities, as well as governments. These organizations are developed to carry out complex policies and procedures or to deliver multiple services or products in a fair, consistent, and effective manner. 13.1, several theories have been offered to explain bureaucracies. The Webernerian model posits the bureaucracies are rational, hierarchical organizations in which decisions are based on logical reasoning. The acquisitive model view of top-level bureaucrats also pressing for even larger budgets and staffs to augment their own sense of power and security. The monopolistic model focuses on the environment in which most government bureaucracies operate, stating that bureaucracies are inefficient and excessively costly to operate because they have no competitors. 13.2. Since the founding of the United States, the federal bureaucracy has grown from 50 to about 2.7 million employees, excluding the military. Federal, state, and local employees together make up more than 16% of the nation's civilian labor force. The federal bureaucracy consists of 15 cabinet departments, as well as a large number of independent executive agencies, independent regulatory agencies, and government corporations. These entities enjoy varying degrees of autonomy, visibility, and political support. 13.3, a federal bureaucracy of career civil servants was formed during Thomas Jefferson's presidency. Andrew Jackson implemented a spoils system through which he appointed his own political supporters. A civil service based on professionalism and merit was the goal of the Civil Service Reform Act of 1883. Concerns that the civil service be freed from the pressures of politics prompt the passage of the Hatch Act in 1939. Significant changes in the administration of the civil service were made by the Civil Service Program Act of 1978. 13.4. Bureaucracies, due to their size and complexity, may become inefficient and slow. Presidents try to manage the bureaucracies through political appointments to top positions. Congress also becomes frustrated when it receives reports of corruption and malfeasance in the bureaucracies. To solve some of these problems, many attempts have been made to make the federal bureaucracy more open, efficient, and responsive to the needs of the U.S. citizens. The most important reforms have included sunshine and sunset law privatization strategies to provide incentives for increased productivity and efficient and protection for whistleblowers. 13.5, the bureaucracy has a complex relationship with the political branch of the government. Although it reports to the president, the Congress oversees the bureaucracy and provides its budget. In addition, Congress delegates much of its authority for federal agencies when it creates new laws. The bureaucrats who run these agencies become important policymakers because Congress has neither the time nor the technical expertise to oversee the administrations of its law. In the agency rulemaking process, a proposed regulation is established. A comment period follows. During the interested parties may offer suggestions for changes. Because the companies and other organizations have challenged many regulations in court, federal agencies now are authorized to allow parties that will be affected by new regulations to participate in the rule drafting process. 13.6, Congress exerts ultimate control over all federal agencies because it controls the federal government's purse strings. It also established the general guidelines by which regulatory agency must abide. The appropriation process may provide a way to send messages of approval or disapproval to a particular agency, as do congressional hearings and investigations of agency actions. So that is the end. And I have some information. If you guys are interested in some online resources, there is the federal register. So www.federalregister.gov. There's the Plum Book. So that one is www.gov.gov/content/PKG/GPO-PLUMBOOK-2016 PDF GPO-PLUMBOOK-2016 PDF. So that's the Plum Book if you guys are interested in the Plum Book. And then us.gov is another website to get some information. So yeah, that's basically it. There's some more information though, like printed resources in this book, media resources if you're interested, and some cool pictures like the triangle, the iron triangle. So yeah, you can find that. Let's see if they have that information. If you interested in seeing the iron triangle. Oh, they don't have that one. Sorry, I can't give you that information to get. But I'm sure they have a similar. You can find it like if you Google and go like to the images. I'm sure you can find like an iron triangle. But thank you so much. So that completes the bureaucracy. So we're done. Hooray! So I'm excited. So I'm just gonna go and do like a review study guide, because there's gonna be a test. But yeah, I'll be working on a campaign paper. So I'm probably gonna read chapter 14, which will be, let me see, chapter 14 is the court. The courts. So if you're interested in the courts, I will be doing that one next while working on like the campaign paper, like along the side because it's due on the 1st. But thank you for tuning in. So bye.